You are financially taking care of your aging parents, which is really hard because you've got your own debt. How do you do that? Ted is here. Let's begin.
This is Debt Free in 30. Here's your host, Doug Hoyes.
I'm Doug Hoyes, that's Ted Michaelis, and 25 years ago, we co-founded Hoyes, Michaelis & Associates.
25 years ago.
And how did we come up with that name? We couldn't think of anything else. And so, here's my first question for you. Over the last decade or so, what is the average age of the people we help with a consumer proposal or a bankruptcy here at Hoyes, Michaelis?
43.
43 is the correct answer. And in fact, I looked at the stats, and in both 2011 and 2023, the average age was exactly 42.8 years old.
Okay, 43.
So there you go. So there's your 43. Now, averages, of course, can be deceiving, but last year, about 3/4 of our clients were between the ages of 30 and 59. That's not a surprise.
So a bell curve with 43 at the top, that makes sense.
Exactly. Because people who are 20 years old aren't going bankrupt, and people who are 90 years old aren't going bankrupt.
There aren't many of them.
There aren't many.
Some.
So here's the question for everybody watching, and then Ted, you get to answer this as well.
Okay.
What are the common characteristics of someone in their late 30s, 40s, or 50s? Well,
So just looking at our averages, they probably have a dependent.
So there you go. Number one, you're more likely to have kids who are a dependent.
That's right.
If you're 18 years old, you haven't had a kid yet, and if you're 90, the kids are already gone.
It's a pretty equal split, though, between married and single-parent households, right? That's my recollection.
Yeah. So again, we're sort of picturing in our mind that person. Okay, they've got a kid, and they are what we call the sandwich generation.
Yep.
Which means what?
Well, so they've got their own kids they're looking after and their parents that they're starting to look after. They're in the middle.
Right. And that's really the whole key to
the crux of this.
That I'm not yet at my peak earning years.
Right, because that happens probably in your 50s.
Yeah, so I'm the, maybe I'm the lead hand at the factory, but I'm not the shop manager.
Right.
I'm the VP, I'm not the president.
The house isn't paid for. Your kids are now getting into activities that cost more and more money. Now you're having to look after some of your parents' expenses because maybe they're not completely with it anymore. There are all sorts of issues that get these sandwich people.
Right. So you got your income is not yet at its peak, but your expenses are at their peak.
Right.
That's the big problem. And you're right. You're supporting your kids, obviously, because they're still, in school. And maybe you're also helping out your parents.
And if anything goes wrong at this age, you don't have the resources to fall back on. So you're probably going to be at peak debt. You're going to incur more debt to deal with these emergencies because you just haven't had time to save.
Exactly right. And our stats show that the peak debt, between 40 and 59 years old is around $60,000 of unsecured debt. So it's very common for our clients to have their own kids, but to also be financially helping their parents.
Right.
They may be health caregivers.
Right.
But they also may be financial caregivers. So what does being a financial caregiver involve? Well, a bunch of things. So let's go through the list here. Helping them with budgeting and paying bills.
Right. And that's the single most thing that people are most upset about. The parents aren't happy about having to share with their kids their budgeting and their bill paying history, and the kids aren't happy about asking about it. It makes everybody uncomfortable. So there's a layer of stress to this that people just don't appreciate.
Yeah, and that's a key point. There's a layer of stress. There's financial implications, but there's also the mental stress of all of this. And I think the expression that summarizes that is once a parent, always a parent.
Right.
So if you're, 60 years old and your parent is 90 years old, they're still your parent. They still think of you as their kid because you are their kid.
Yeah, and they should be looking after you, not you looking after them.
And that's why it gets kind of embarrassing that, okay, I got to ask my kids for help. Now, I ask my kids for help all the time because I can't figure out that thing on the computer and I don't know what button to push.
It's a little different.
And that's something I'm not embarrassed about because I know I don't know what I'm talking about, so I'm happy to ask them. But if you've been the provider your whole life and now it's like, boy, I'm getting confused by all this stuff that's going on and cash is tight, that's when it gets a little tricky.
Right.
And so the whole budgeting, paying bills is a big aspect of it. And that obviously relates to things like managing bank accounts and investments.
Right.
So it's very common as your parents get older to say, hey, you know what? Why don't you put me on your bank account so that I can at least go in and help you pay your hydro bill if there's an issue or
and I can keep an eye on things because when Unfortunately, there's a fair bit of elder abuse in our culture as well. So people take advantage of the elderly, get them to make donations or contributions or just give money to things that they don't even remember doing.
Yeah, and so it's that, and we're going to talk about the practical side of this as we go. So what else is involved in being a financial caregiver? Well, coordinating health and long-term care expenses.
Right.
So that would be things like paying for, budgeting or researching funding sources for medical treatments, medications, long-term care services, all that kind of thing. And that's very confusing.
It is. I mean, that most communities now have some sort of resource that you can tap into, but the seniors aren't aware of that anyway. So you've got to help bridge that gap. No one's going to be as interested in your parents as you are.
And we're going to talk about some of those resources in a minute. So there's also the obvious resources that every Canadian is potentially eligible for: old age security and CPP.
Right.
And so, of course, the rules for CPP are, well, you can start claiming it under normal circumstances, I believe, as early as age 60.
Right, they reduce it by a third.
Yeah, there's a lesser, or you can delay it until age 70. Well, that's the kind of thing that you only apply for CPP once in your life.
Yep.
How do you do it? What's the thought process? That's an area where kids end up helping their adult parents trying to navigate that. And how exactly do you apply for it? Is there a website you go to? Is there a button you push? I don't know.
I think they sent me a letter.
I think they sent me a letter too. Yes, because we are
do you want
both,
your money now?
We are both over the age of 60, so we are eligible to get it. And we, of course, ignored the letter because we didn't understand it.
Right.
There's also handling legal and estate planning matters.
Right.
So, and again, we're going to talk about this in the practical advice section, but you kind of want to make sure you've got things like wills and power of attorney and all that kind of set up. And we'll talk about that in a minute. And then there's financial decision-making and problem solving. This is a little more nebulous because this is making the tough calls around spending priorities. Do I pay down debt? Do I sell assets? What do I do? So these are all aspects of financial caregiving. And as I said, it can range from the day-to-day expenses to fully managing finances. It's a role, and this kind of echoes what you had already said, it's a role that combines financial responsibility with emotional and ethical considerations.
Right.
It's tough.
Mm-hmm.
This is not simple. And to make it even more difficult, what happens if you've got your own debt?
Yeah. So not only do you have the pressures of dealing with what's going on in your parents' lives, but you've got your own life to deal with. And often when things go wrong, they go wrong across the board.
All across the board. So if you're a multimillionaire and your parents need a little bit of help, well, no problem. Here you go. Here's $1 million. No problem, right? I'll buy you a house. I'll do anything.
Do we know a lot of people like that?
I don't know anybody like that, as a matter of fact. So as a result, I'm kind of constrained as well. We've gone through, recessions and tough times and layoffs and cash is tight. And now my parents are also in a difficult situation.
Right.
So how do you prioritize your own situation versus your parent situation? Whose needs get priority?
Well, you can only do as much as you can do. And if your choice is a roof over your head versus a roof over your parents' head, then you should probably be looking at, can you either get your parents into housing or can they come live with you somehow? I mean, it's your first obligation has to be to your immediate family, and then you've got to decide, well, can I help my parents beyond that?
And it's not easy. Like this is not, and this is exactly like when you're in the airplane and the oxygen mask pops out of the sky.
Right.
They tell you put yours on first.
That's right, because if you pass out, you can't put it on your kids or your parents.
So you've got to you got to put yourself first. That's just the way it has to be, or else you're not able to help anyone else. So part of the decisions though are: so do I pay down my own debt? Mm-hmm. Because if I pay down my own debt, well, that gives me more financial flexibility in the future.
Right.
But that's money that I don't have to help my parents right now. Mm-hmm. There's no right answer to this. It's a tough question.
And every situation is unique.
And then the stress part comes, and again, you alluded to this as well, is so talking to your parents. What resources do you have that you can tap into? Because if your parents own a house, for example,
right.
Okay, so maybe they're on a pension and don't have a lot of money coming in, but they've got wealth stored in the house. Mm-hmm. So what do you do?
Right. Do you sell the house? Do you do a reverse mortgage? I hate those things, by the way. They've got options, but one, they probably haven't thought about them. And two, they're not going to like it when you interfere.
So let's skip ahead to this whole practical considerations in your comment about reverse mortgages then. We'll get back to the script in a minute.
Okay.
So what is a reverse mortgage and why do you hate it?
So reverse mortgage is they're companies that will lend you money without any repayment plan involved. I believe the limit right now is up to 55%, but it depends on the appraised value of your home. And so what happens is you borrow this money either as monthly payments or a lump sum. They'll do it different ways, but you want to think of it as a line of credit on your house. And so if you're not making the payment, then every month they're adding interest to that amount, which is why they won't give you 100% of the money or 80% of the money. They want to leave enough room that if they give you 45% of your house's worth and you don't pay them anything for 20 years, they're going to get repaid because of the residual value that's still in the house.
And so how do they get repaid?
Well, and so when the house is sold or refinanced, it's a charge that's got to get paid out. And the problem I have with them is the interest rates aren't as favorable as a first mortgage. And you are definitely, it's a planned system where you're paying interest on the interest. So compounding interest is always the most expensive way to borrow.
Yeah. So in an example where the house is worth $1 million, maybe they give you $500,000.
Right.
That's fantastic. I've now got $500,000.
And the interest in the first year, let's say it's 8%. I'm just picking a number. That's probably pretty accurate right now. So 8% interest on $500,000 is $40,000. So it's going to be a little higher than that because they charge this interest every month, right?
And there's probably some hidden fees. So at the end of the first year, you owe $540,000.
Right.
And then at the end of the second year, you're going to owe close to $600,000.
Yep.
And then it just keeps going up and up.
It's a snowball.
Yeah. And so if you live in the house for 30 years, I guess you're going to end up owing $3 million on the house. Well, that's fine. They only can get it all. Yeah, they just get it all. So a reverse mortgage is a good option where you want to stay in your home. Mm-hmm. Maybe it's actually better to stay in your home because you're not paying $5,000 or $10,000 a month to live in a facility or whatever. But you need obviously the money to be paying the property taxes, paying the hydro, paying for in-care help and whatever. So your advice would be either to avoid a reverse mortgage, either sell the home or get a line of credit or mortgage. Something. But you have to borrow enough to be able to make the payments on it.
Correct.
And so a lot of it depends on how long do you think you're going to be in the house?
That's right. I mean, frankly, the most reasonable option is usually that it's time to seriously consider downsizing.
Yeah.
So that you take advantage of the equity in your house, you move into something more affordable and more manageable in your senior years, and then you go from there.
Yeah, and I love living in my big, huge house, but maybe it's time to move to a smaller place so that my living expenses are lower and it's obviously easier to care for. Right. And this is exactly why this is a difficult discussion to have.
Right.
Because if you've lived in the same house for 3 decades, it's your house, you know all the neighbors, you're very familiar with everything, but I get it. You get to the point where it's kind of hard to be cutting the lawn and shoveling the driveway and doing everything else, but I also don't want to live in a little small place with a bunch of people I don't know.
Right.
So there's not just the financial implications, but there's the mental implications of it as well. So there's no easy answer on this. Okay, so we just talked about reverse mortgages or mortgages in general, which are one type of financial support, which is tapping into the equity in your house. There's a bunch of other ones that are available to bridge the gap. So, and we're not going to talk in any kind of detail about these. I'll put links in the show notes. So if you're watching on YouTube, just go to the bottom. And if you're listening on Spotify or Apple Podcasts or whatever, they'll all be there.
Tells you where to look.
Tells you where to look because we're not the experts in this stuff. Come on, let's be honest here. The Canada Caregiver Credit. So this is something where you support a spouse or parent because of a physical or mental impairment, and the tax credit is worth somewhere between about $2,500 and about $8,000. There's based on different criteria.
Right.
So this is not enough to support your parents.
It isn't.
It's a few extra bucks.
Mm-hmm.
So if you're in a situation like that, check it out. There's also a provincial version of it. There's also employment insurance caregiving benefits. EI caregiving benefits provide financial assistance while you're away from work to care for or support a critically ill or injured person or someone needing end-of-life care. You can receive 55% of your earnings up to a maximum of $668 a week, up to 15 weeks or up to 26 weeks for end-of-life care. So this is obviously a very specific thing that is not applicable if, well, my parents are starting to have some trouble and they're going to be around for another 20 years. This is a much more specific thing.
Right.
You also mentioned community-based resources. Mm-hmm. So this is something also to be checking out. There's nonprofits like the Alzheimer's Society of Canada, the Canadian Cancer Society. They've got specific resources for caregivers of people with certain conditions. They do have, in some cases, financial assistance or grants.
Right.
There are employee assistance programs. Mm-hmm. So through your work, many employers offer EAPs that provide counseling, support services for caregivers dealing with a lot of this stress.
And again, they'll point you in the right direction to apply for financial assistance and other tools and resources that you need. Which is
the point. And then Ontario does have a direct funding program that provides money to eligible individuals so they can hire caregivers directly. So again, links to the show notes in all of that. Okay, let's talk about some other non-financial resources or things you can do to help. So the first one that we alluded to earlier is, budgeting and paying bills and managing bank accounts and investments. So how would that work in real life? Is it as simple as give me your login to your website, or is there potentially more to it than that?
Well, you've got to decide the degree of help or assistance you're going to give them and the degree or help of assistance they're willing to accept. So with budgeting, you got to start with, we need to assess where we're at. So what have we been spending? Where's the money going? Which of these are discretionary and maybe we can cut back on? So that's a conversation you've got to have. And then depending on how that conversation goes, you'll have to decide, do I need to be monitoring the bank account? Do I need to be assisting in a more proactive way, actually making these payments on their behalf, that sort of thing?
And in my experience, it starts slow and gets more bigger, if that's a financial way to say it. Biggerer, I think is the correct word. So It may start off with, hey, you know what? Let's have a joint bank account. We'll put both of our names on it so that we can both see it on the interweb there. Yep. And that way, if you break your foot and you're not able to do stuff, no problem. I can go in and take your pension and pay your hydro and all that kind of stuff.
Right.
What is the downside to being joint on your parents' bank account?
Well, so if there's an overdraft on that bank account or you're joint on credit card debts or anything, you're now legally liable for those debts.
And that's a key point because joint doesn't mean 50-50.
Right.
It means 100%.
Well, and also it'll have impact on your own credit report.
If there's overdrafts and things get in trouble.
Bounce checks or anything else.
So I don't see a huge downside to being joint on a bank account that doesn't have overdraft protection.
Probably isn't unless they start bouncing checks.
So, okay, maybe you end up on the hook for $100 worth of NSF fees or something, not the end of the world. I can see a lot of problems with being joint on a credit card.
Right.
So can you envision a case where you would want to be joint on your parents' credit card?
Well, you have to assume that, it's your credit card as opposed to theirs. And so you're giving them access to a card and you've got to control how it gets used.
Yeah. So, okay, again, if it's $1,000 limit, I guess you're exposed to the tune of $1,000. Mm-hmm. But I don't see a whole lot of upside for anybody in that particular case.
Right.
If you're going to be providing financial assistance, here you go. Here's the cash. Then I know I'm limited.
But, you basically got to decide on what your parents' mental capacity is. So are they still responsible enough that they can have their own credit cards, their own bank accounts, and all these things? So if they still are responsible and they're going to act responsibly, it's okay. It's when they turn that corner that you've got to be ready for it and then take some stronger measures.
Yeah, and today it's really easy to spend money because you just click a button and boom.
Right.
And so I think separating your finances is a good idea with respect to debt.
Right.
But being able to help with the bank account kind of makes sense as well.
Well, and as an example, you're not likely to give your parents access to your primary bank account. You're going to either get access to theirs or you're going to set up a new account for the two of you. Mm-hmm. So it's a different mindset. You're thinking it may be the same thing, but it's not. You're not trying to give them access to your paychecks. You're going to get access to their pensions. Yeah,
because you're there to help them with it. So, and I agree, the cleanest way to do that is brand new bank account. We both go into the bank. We put both of our names on it.
Right.
I mean, obviously it helps if you bank at the same bank as your parent does, which maybe you do, maybe you don't.
Yeah.
But that's certainly something to be available to help out with. We already talked about assisting in applying for financial assistance.
Right.
Ensuring taxes are filed.
Yeah, this is a bigger problem than some people realize because it's pretty easy to forget filing your taxes, right? And if they don't file them, first, the pensions will stop, which is I guess it's a safety valve. You'll know by the summer that they haven't filed their taxes, but there may be other issues as well. That's how you're going to find out, did they cash out a bunch of investments or things that maybe you didn't even know about.
Yeah, I don't know if they stop your CPP when you stop filing your taxes, but you're certainly not getting your Canada carbon credit and anything that's linked to your taxes isn't being done. Your GST credits, whatever.
Right.
So our advice for every single Canadian:
file your taxes.
File your taxes. Like this is not hard. Well, maybe it is hard, but it's you got to do it. It's just part of the process. So just get it done. And so it may be that you end up taking over the filing of the taxes for your parents.
The responsibility.
Because you're doing it anyways, and everything's electronic now. It's not the hardest thing in the world. POAs.
Yeah, power of attorney.
So there's two kinds. There's personal care and property. What's the difference? What are we talking about here?
So personal care are health decisions. Like if I'm incapacitated, who gets to decide that enough is enough? Or that I should be looking at certain types of treatment and not others?
Do I have the surgery or not?
Right. That's personal. So that's pretty straightforward. Property, it's also straightforward. Who's got legal responsibility to make decisions regarding your finances?
So I've got a GIC at the bank that comes due in a year. Who makes the decision to roll it over for another year? That would be the power of attorney for property. Mm-hmm. And if you have that power of attorney for your parents, then it has to be lodged with the bank.
Somebody needs to know about it.
Yeah. You can't just phone up the bank and say, I got power of attorney. Or they're going, it's not in our computer.
Right.
So this is something you want to do well in advance of when it's needed.
That's right.
So you actually go to the bank with the original copy of the power of attorney. Hey, Mr. Bank person, can you type it into the computer?
Right.
And it's a more cumbersome process than I'm describing.
Well, and it's a step beyond being joint on a bank account. Mm-hmm. So being joint on a bank account, you're both liable for the account. When you have power of attorney, you're stepping into that other person's shoes. It doesn't make you liable.
Right. And if we're talking about assets, well, I guess there's nothing to be liable for.
Right.
But if your parent has a TFSA and an RSP and a bank account or whatever, well, that power of attorney has to be linked to all three of those different accounts.
Right.
And this is something that has to be done while you both have the capacity to do it.
Yep.
You can't wait till it's too late and then start and then get that done. So this is a place where you got to be much more proactive. And just because you have the power of attorney, your parent still has the ability to do everything.
Right. And it doesn't let you override what they're doing. This is if they're incapable, you are able to.
And that's
it's permission.
Right. It's permission. And of course, maybe this is not obvious, but once your parent dies, there's no power of attorney anymore.
Right, because this is your power of attorney over a deceased person.
Yeah, you stepped into their shoes are no longer being stepped into. So, okay, and which brings us, I guess, to the final point, which is making the tough decisions around spending priorities and debt management and, should I be liquidating stuff or all that. So,
right.
How do you make those tough decisions? How do you decide if your parents should be paying down debt or using extra funds? Maybe you should be paying down your own debt. Right. Like, is there any, like, how do you start that thought process?
You've got to gather as much information as you can. So, I mean, accountants, we'd say you'd crunch the numbers. Mm-hmm. So you find out what are all of these debts, what are whatever investments that they have, what are their obligations, what are their responsibilities, and then put together a plan.
Which is the same thing you would do for yourself or anyone else.
Exactly. The difference is you don't have firsthand knowledge until you start asking those questions.
And I think you've also got a more compressed timeline.
Probably.
Because when you're 30 years old and you're deciding for yourself, well, do I put money into my retirement account, my kid's RESP, do I pay down debt? You've got a runway of another 50 years. But when you're dealing with a parent who has a runway of 5 or 10 years, it's a bit more compressed.
Who knows? Yes.
And it's, these are all very difficult things. So practical advice. Number one, crunch the numbers. And you're making a budget for both you as to how much resources you can help them with,
right,
and your parents to see what's reasonable. And then assuming there is a shortfall, because if your parents are multi-billionaires, this is probably not a big issue, then you want to look at all the different resources you can draw on. So selling assets is the most obvious one,
right,
but also the most difficult to discuss.
Yep. I mean, so use the example of the family cottage. They've had it forever. They want to pass it on to the children. We don't even know if the children want the damn thing, but there's a lot of value tied up in that, and they could really use the money. And
if you have 4 children, how do you pass a cottage on to 4 children?
Well, one gets the boathouse, one gets the deck.
That's right, yeah. One gets the outhouse. It's conceptually, well, we've all been coming up to the cottage for 40 years. How hard is this? Well, yeah, right, but when 4 people now own it, who's making the decisions about how do we fix the dock when it breaks?
Ruled by committee.
Yeah.
We know how well that works, particularly with siblings.
Right. It's and there will be one sibling who wants to use it a lot, one sibling who never goes up there because they live on the other end of the country. These are all very, very difficult decisions. From a financial point of view, well, if we sell the cottage now, then we've got the money that we can use to support ourselves, and we eliminate all the difficulties. But so selling assets, and you already addressed the bigger one, which is the house.
Right.
Do you still need a car or two as you get older? What about, different investments? Do you really need something?
I'll give you a more basic example. A friend of mine's father died, and his mother had been in the habit of going to the hairstylist once a week. And nobody paid any attention to that fact for the first 2 years after his father died. And she spent a huge portion of what the money they thought she'd be living on for the next 10 years because nobody was paying attention. And it was $100 a week. It just disappeared.
And if you've got two incomes coming in, we both got our pension, we both got this. But when one of the pensions is either reduced or eliminated, then that obviously makes a big difference. So being aware of the budgeting aspect is obviously pretty important. We already talked about, of course, in terms of resources, government support programs and so on. And then there's siblings and other relatives who are able to provide, either home care or financial assistance.
Additional resources. It becomes a family situation.
Yeah. And of course, one kid will live relatively close to the parents. One kid lives in California.
Right.
So kind of hard for the California kid to be dropping by and stopping. So you kind of have to be thinking about all of that as well to see what's able to be done. And then from a practical point of view, if I'm staying in the home, what modifications does the house need?
Right.
Because I can't keep climbing 3 flights of stairs, and do I, how does that all work?
You said it earlier. How do you look after the yard? There's all sorts of implications to staying in a house.
So let's say that you do all of that and you yourself have a bunch of debt.
Right.
And so it's like, okay, I know that I'm kind of constrained. It's going to be difficult for me to be helping my parents. So I guess I got to focus on reducing my own debt first.
Well, so one of the benefits to having to do this for your parents is you take a good hard look at yourself and try to sort out, well, where am I at? And if you're not able to do the things you had hoped you could do for your parents because you got too much debt, this is a warning sign. Okay, let's sort it out. If it's more than you can handle personally, well, maybe you need to talk to somebody like Doug or myself to do a consumer proposal to reduce the debt to a manageable level so you can do some of these other things.
And we've had a lot of cases where we get a call from somebody and they say, yeah, my mother, my father, they got a bunch of debt. I'd like you to talk to them. So we talk to them and we go, well, you're, long since retired. Your only income is CPP and OAS. Nobody can sue you. Nobody can garnish your wages. You don't have any assets. You know what? The debts are probably not your biggest priority. It's your living expenses that you are. But since we're talking with the family, Junior.
What's going on in your life?
Right. Now, Junior's 40 years old, but, Junior.
43.
43. Yeah, that's right. 42.8 years old. Maybe we need to look at solutions for you.
Right.
And we end up doing a lot of proposals for the adult children of elderly parents because that then helps them free up the cash to help their parents.
Right. The whole thing, something has triggered a time where you're willing to look for resources that you wouldn't normally consider, and they may be more applicable to you than to the parents.
And a lot of people might be wondering, why are you guys doing this show right before Christmas? This is kind of creepy, talking about, the financial caregiving and taking care of aging parents.
Because this is when you find out about this
Exactly.
stuff.
And that's why we have timed this. And, of course, a lot of people will be watching this sometime in 2025 or 2026 or whatever.
Right.
But we timed this deliberately because this is the time of year when families do get together.
Right.
And so it's not a bad time to, when you're talking, when you're going for a walk, whatever, to say, hey, how's it going? Are you keeping up with things? What's happening?
Well, and start with the basics. Who's going to shovel your walk this year, Dad?
Yep.
Oh, all right. Well, you're having any trouble paying the bills.
Yeah.
And you just, it's natural.
Yeah. You can stay in your home if you've got someone to do this, and this, but that's costly. Are there other different options? So I think now is the perfect time to address this, both with your parents and with yourself, to try to get everything sorted out.
Right.
So there you go. Not the most fun topic, but I think a critically important topic. And a lot of these decisions, particularly things like powers of attorneys and wills, have to be dealt with now, not later.
Do them well in advance, because if you leave it to the last minute, somebody may not have the mental capacity to do it. And there could be, there probably something has gone wrong if you leave it to the last minute, and now you're dealing with too many things at the same time.
Yeah, getting some good advice from a financial advisor about how to set things up in advance. There's ways to avoid probate and a whole bunch of different reasons. You got to do it in advance, though. So that's something we would strongly encourage you to do. So to close, if this particular topic, we've had a number of people question us about. So if you've got a question or a topic you'd like us to cover on future shows, hit us up on social media, leave a comment on YouTube or any of the other platforms, and we will absolutely consider it. Next week is our final show of the year, which is, one of my favorite shows because we review our predictions for 2024 and we give our, I guess people have to tune in next week and find out. In some areas we did pretty good. Others, we were a little crazy. So does not appear that my inflation prediction would be correct, but we'll do it. So you're going to want to tune in next week to see how we did. So you want to make sure you are following us on YouTube. And next week's show is one you'll probably want to watch on YouTube because we put the charts up on the screen and show you where we're getting all our numbers. And I'm actually going to play a couple of clips from the prior year where I said, this is what's going to happen. And then we can all laugh at me when it didn't exactly tune out. So follow on YouTube, subscribe, notifications. You guys know how to do it. We're also on all of the audio platforms, Spotify, Apple Podcast, and so on. So please like and subscribe. And until next week's year-end prediction and review show, thanks for listening. I'm Doug Hoyes. That was Debt Free in 30.